Every Monday night, my husband left the house. One night, he forgot his phone, and it rang. A woman's voice. Are you on your way? Hi, welcome to my channel. I've got a new story for you today.
Every Monday night, my husband would leave the house, but one day he forgot his phone, and a call came in. It was a woman's voice. Are you on your way? Don't make me wait like last Monday. My heart nearly stopped. It was our 18th wedding anniversary. I didn't say a word, just quietly hung up and secretly wrote down the address. When I learned the truth, I was devastated and numb. But what happened next made my husband turn pale and collapse. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. After that call and the address, if you were in her place, what would you do next? Comment below. Note: this is a fictional story. Any similarities are purely coincidental, but it carries a meaningful and insightful message. The foyer mirror at 142 Shellmore Boulevard is a silent witness to the performance of my life. It has a heavy, ornate frame reflecting a version of reality that we have spent 18 years perfecting. Every Monday at 6:45 p.m., I stand before it, acting as the quiet anchor for a household that exudes effortless grace. My name is Sloane Mercer. I am 41, a woman who once commanded courtrooms, but now ensures the jasmine is pruned and the silver is polished. Mount Pleasant is a sanctuary of Southern charm, and our home is its crown jewel. A low-country masterpiece with white columns, it sits in the heart of Uyon to the neighbors. We are the gold standard of the American dream. We are the Mercers. Grant the powerhouse attorney, Sloane the devoted wife. We are the couple people toasted at the yacht club. Our smiles as synchronized as the white sails on the Cooper River. Tonight the kitchen smelled of roasted rosemary chicken. I stood by the marble island watching Grant through the doorway. He was in the foyer performing his Monday night ritual. First, the adjustment of the navy blazer, then the fastening of the top button, followed by the middle. Finally, a sharp tug at the French cuffs. He didn't just dress for a meeting. He armed himself for an audience layering on the persona of the legal titan. The sterling merger is hitting a snag. Sloane, Grant said, his voice projecting that calm authority that made juries lean in. It was a voice designed to be believed. The board is in a tailspin, and these late-night sessions are the only way to keep the account. Don't wait up, honey. I walked toward him, my slippers silent on the pine floors. Another Monday, another crisis. I replied, my tone light. After nearly 2 decades, I had learned that harmony was a choice, a daily negotiation where truth was traded for a peaceful evening. I reached out and smoothed his lapel, catching the scent of his sandalwood aftershave. I searched for a flicker in his eyes, a shadow of guilt or hesitation, but there was nothing but the impenetrable surface of a man who spent his life winning arguments. Someone has to steer the ship, Sloane. He whispered, his smile as practiced as his closing statements. He pressed a brief, dry kiss to my cheek, a social obligation rather than an intimate connection. You know how it is. Mercer and Sterling doesn't run itself. He grabbed his keys, the heavy fob for the Porsche clinking, and with one last nod, he walked out. The mahogany door clicked shut, an echo that vibrated through the high-ceilinged rooms long after he had gone. I stayed in the foyer staring at the closed door. Our life was built on these quiet acceptances. 18 years is a long time to construct a monument to the word fine. We had started in a cramped apartment downtown back when we were young associates, fueled by caffeine and ambition. Now we had the dream. We had the address. We had Piper. Our 21-year-old daughter finishing her senior year at the College of Charleston, a girl whose social media was a gallery of sun-drenched beaches. We had Grady, 15, who was upstairs, the low vibration of his video games the only sign of life. From the outside, we had everything. Our family photos were masterpieces of coordination, but from the inside, the house felt like a museum, beautiful to look at. But you were afraid to touch anything for fear of breaking the spell. I had spent years cultivating a quality of not asking. It wasn't paranoia, and it wasn't exactly trust. It was a practice stillness that I called peace. As long as the bills were paid and the children were thriving, I could ignore the slight variations in his excuses. Last week, it was a deposition prep. The week before, an emergency client dinner at Hall's Chop House. Always a reason and always on a Monday. I walked back to the kitchen where the silence had a shape, a heavy, hollow presence. I poured a cup of tea, watching the steam rise in thin spirals. I took the mug to the kitchen window, the cool marble pressing against my palms. The sun had already dipped, leaving the South Carolina sky a bruised shade of purple and orange. Outside, 142 Shellmore Boulevard was transitioning into its evening glow. I watched the silver glint of Grant's Porsche reach the end of the driveway. The red glow of his taillights flared as he paused at the stop sign. Then he made the turn, heading toward the Ravenel Bridge, heading away from the life we had spent 18 years constructing. A dog barked in the distance, a neighbor's retriever sounding thin and lonely. I looked at my reflection in the window glass, superimposed over the darkening yard. Who was this woman? The lawyer I used to be, the one who could dismantle a witness, wouldn't recognize the woman holding this tea mug. That woman would have seen the holes in the narrative months ago. But I had chosen to be the wife instead. I had chosen the wraparound porch and the quiet life. I had chosen to believe that the Monday night routine was just a quirk of a demanding career. The mug in my hand was no longer warm. The tea had gone cold, a dark, stagnant pool in the porcelain. I realized I was gripping the handle so hard my knuckles were white. The silence in the house grew pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I thought about the children, the firm, the upcoming charity gala. I thought about the image of us, the perfect unit. And then a thought finally broke through. It wasn't new, but tonight it stepped into the light. It wasn't that I hadn't noticed the patterns. It was that I had finally reached the limit of my own silence. Grant's car was long gone, merged into the flow of traffic on the bridge, taking him to a destination that was no longer a mystery I could ignore. I looked at the cold tea, then back at the empty driveway. The peace I had cultivated felt suddenly like a prison. I stand at the kitchen window holding a mug that has gone cold, and for the first time in years, not the first time I noticed, but the first time I let myself notice, I think, I've never once asked where he actually goes. The Monday night Grant left, I did what I always did after he walked out. I called Camille. It was a muscle memory developed over nearly 2 decades, a digital lifeline that bridged the hollow silence of 142 Shellmore Boulevard. Before the engine of the Porsche had even cooled at the end of the driveway, my thumb was already pressing her name on the screen. There is a specific kind of comfort that comes from a person who has seen every version of you, from the ambitious young lawyer to the woman currently staring at a cold mug of tea in a darkening kitchen. Camille Hargrove was that person. She was my person. We had been inseparable for 18 years. To the social circles of Charleston, we were a package deal, the sharp-witted Sloane Mercer and the ethereal younger Camille. She was the daughter of Harlan Hargrove, a man whose name was synonymous with every major real estate development in the Low Country. But to me, she was simply the woman who knew exactly how I took my coffee and exactly when my marriage started to fray at the edges. I had handed her the keys to my internal kingdom, never realizing I was showing her exactly where the fortifications were weakest. As the phone rang, I thought back to the night Grady was born 15 years ago. It remains one of the clearest markers of our history. Grant had been at another client dinner, a high-stakes meeting that he claimed was unmissable, even as my contractions began to sharpen into agonizing waves. I didn't call my mother or a nurse first. I called Camille. She was at the hospital within 20 minutes, her blonde hair messy and her designer heels clicking frantically on the linoleum. Grant's chair remained empty for 12 grueling hours, but Camille never left my side. She held my hand through every surge of pain, wiping the sweat from my forehead and whispering that I was stronger than any legal brief or social expectation. When the doctors finally placed Grady in my arms, It was Camille who took the first photo. It was Camille who told me I was a natural mother while my husband was still trapped in negotiations. Looking back now, the memory feels like a poisoned well, but at the time, it was the only thing keeping me from drowning in resentment. Over the years, I told her everything. I gave her the raw, unedited transcript of my life. During our long lunches at the yacht club or over glasses of crisp Chardonnay on my wraparound porch, I spilled the details of the growing distance between Grant and me. I told her about the nights he turned away from me in bed, the way he looked through me rather than at me, and the bone-deep exhaustion of maintaining the Mercer facade. I shared the exact words we used when we argued the cold. Clinical way, Grant would dismiss my concerns as paranoia or hormonal fatigue. I didn't realize that in those moments of vulnerability, I was handing a map of my insecurities to the very person who was navigating her way into my husband's life. Every secret I whispered was a tool she could use to become his perfect alternative. If I complained that Grant hated my emotional outbursts, she knew to be his calm, stoic sanctuary. If I lamented that we no longer talked about anything but the children, she knew to engage him in the intellectual sparring he craved. She would ask about Grant with the breathless, helpless quality of someone who simply could not stop thinking about a person. "Is Grant still pushing himself so hard at the firm?" she would ask, her voice carrying something I read as concern, but now understand was longing. "He seems so stressed lately. Does he still work late on Mondays? You really should make him take a vacation, Sloan." I thought she was asking because she cared about our family. I understand now that she was asking because she was in love with my husband, and love makes people ask questions they have no right to ask in voices that sound like worry but feel like possession. I remember replaying that specific question in my mind later, but that night I just sighed and thanked her for looking out for us. I felt proud to have a friend who cared enough to notice the shadows under my husband's eyes. I thought I was lucky to have a best friend who treated my family as her own. The irony of it all is a jagged pill to swallow. I was the one who introduced them. It was 12 years ago at my own birthday party. We were living in our first house then, a smaller place, but still elegant. I had spent weeks planning every detail, wanting everything to be flawless. I remember standing in the center of the living room, feeling a surge of pride as I watched my two favorite people meet. Camille looked radiant in a silk slip dress, and Grant was at the height of his early career success. "Grant, this is Camille," I had said, placing a hand on each of their arms, physically connecting the two pillars of my world. "The woman I've been telling you about, my person." I remember the way they looked at each other, a polite professional greeting that betrayed nothing. I remember feeling a sense of accomplishment, thinking that my life was finally complete because the people I loved most finally occupied the same space. I wanted them to be friends. I wanted them to like each other for my sake. I had no idea that I was litigating my own obsolescence. On the phone now, Camille's voice was like velvet, soothing the jagged edges of my evening. "He's gone again. Oh, Sloan, honey, you're too good to him. But you know, Grant, he's married to that firm as much as he's married to you. Just pour yourself another glass of wine and try to relax. I'll come over tomorrow and we can talk it all out, okay?" "Thanks, Camille." I whispered into the receiver, the silence of the kitchen feeling slightly less oppressive. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'll never have to find out," she replied, and for a second her tone was so flat it almost felt like a promise. I hang up the phone feeling as I always did after talking to Camille, slightly less alone. I do not yet understand that this feeling is the most expensive thing I have ever been sold. The morning air in January has a way of stripping the warmth from the low country, leaving the marshes gray and the shadows long. It was a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary morning that usually hums with the mundane rhythms of school drop-offs and grocery lists. I was sitting at the kitchen counter at 142 Shellmore Boulevard, the granite cold beneath my elbows. I had my iPad open, scrolling through our shared family cloud album. I was looking for a specific shot of Grady from his last track meet, something to send to his grandmother Lorraine, who lived for those updates. I was swiping past blurred shots of soccer games and family dinners when the screen flickered refreshing as new data synced from Grant's devices. That was when I saw it. It wasn't tucked away in a hidden folder. It was sitting there in the open, a digital ghost that had accidentally wandered into the light. The photo had been taken at Husk on Queen Street, a restaurant just 2 blocks from Grant's office, a place we usually reserve for anniversaries or high-profile client celebrations. The lighting was low, amber-hued, and intimate, the kind of glow that makes everyone look like a version of themselves they only show at midnight. In the frame, Grant wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at Camille. The specific details of the image began to etch themselves into my retinas like acid. Grant's hand, the hand that had held mine at the yacht club just last weekend, was draped over hers on the white linen tablecloth. It wasn't a casual touch. His fingers were laced with hers in a way that suggested a deep, practiced familiarity. He was leaning forward, his shoulders relaxed, a smile on his face that I had not seen in years. It wasn't the polished, professional grin he used for Mercer and Sterling brochures. It was a soft, genuine expression of adoration, a look of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. The physical experience of shock is surprisingly quiet. There is no ringing in the ears, no dramatic gasp. Instead, the world simply stops breathing. The iPad remained in my hands, a heavy slate of glass and metal that felt suddenly alien. I looked around the kitchen. The sunlight was still streaming through the window, catching the dust motes dancing over the sink. The refrigerator hummed its steady, indifferent song. The world was still turning, the neighbors were still driving their SUVs toward the city, and the jasmine was still clinging to the porch railing. Everything was exactly the same, yet everything had been irrevocably shattered. I put the iPad down on the counter. My movements were slow, deliberate, as if I were made of glass and might shatter if I moved too quickly. I stood up and made a pot of coffee. I watched the dark liquid drip into the carafe, focusing on the sound, the steam, the triviality of the task. When it was done, I poured a cup and drank the entire thing while standing at the sink, staring at the brick wall of the neighbor's house. I didn't taste the bean or the cream. I was looking at nothing, waiting for the reality to settle into my bones. After a few minutes, I picked the iPad back up. I half expected the image to have vanished, to have been a hallucination born of a January chill. But the photo was still there. Grant's navy blazer, Camille's delicate wrist, the half-empty wine glasses reflecting the candlelight of Husk. 18 years. The number echoed in my head like a tolling bell. I thought about Camille holding my hand when Grady was born, her voice whispering encouragement while my husband was at work. I thought about every brunch, every holiday, every glass of wine we had shared on my porch. I thought about every conversation I had ever had with her about the distance in my marriage. Every time I had cried on her shoulder about Grant's late nights, I had been giving her the blueprints to my own destruction. I had described the locks on the doors, and she had simply walked in with the key I gave her. A specific kind of cold began to radiate from the center of my chest. It had nothing to do with the winter weather outside or the draft coming from the foyer. It was a glacial internal shift. It was the feeling of a woman realizing she had been living in a house built of smoke and mirrors, and the wind had finally picked up. I did not cry. There were no tears, no screaming, no urge to throw the expensive porcelain against the backsplash. Instead, some part of me, an old, careful, self-preserving part that I had buried under layers of domesticity, had already begun to understand. The litigator I used to be, the one who lived for the moment a witness trapped themselves in a lie, stood up and dusted herself off. She didn't want to mourn. She wanted to assess the damages. I walked to the mudroom and picked up my car keys. I didn't leave a note. I didn't check the locks. I walked out to my car and began to drive. I didn't have a destination in mind until I found myself pulling into the parking lot of the Harris Teeter on Johnny Dodds Boulevard. It was a busy morning, filled with mothers pushing strollers and retirees, loading groceries into their trunks. I sat there in the driver's seat for a long time, the engine idling, watching the mundane traffic of suburban life. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked the same curated makeup, the same expensive haircut, but the eyes belonged to a stranger. I realized then that I couldn't call Camille. For the first time in 18 years, the one person I would normally turn to in a crisis was the crisis itself. The silence in the car was absolute. I reached for my phone, my fingers steady now. I scrolled past Camille's name, past Grant's office number, until I found a contact I hadn't called in months. I took a breath, the cold air filling my lungs with a sharp, clarifying sting. Then I called Nora. Nora listened to everything I said without interrupting once. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, filled only with the distant sound of Charleston traffic and my own jagged breathing. I had spilled it all the photo at Husk, the 18 years of Camille's friendship, the Monday night shadows. When I finished, she was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then she said, "Sloan, you are still a lawyer. Start thinking like one." Those words were a bucket of ice water poured over my soul. They stripped away the grief, the self-pity, and the suffocating mantle of the Mount Pleasant housewife. Nora didn't offer a shoulder to cry on. She offered a mirror. She reminded me that before I was a Mercer, before I was a mother, I was a woman who could cite case law in her sleep and find the weakness in any argument. The conversation in that Harris Teeter parking lot shifted gears instantly. Nora's voice became practical, unsentimental, and sharp. She didn't ask how I felt. She asked what I had. "Don't delete that photo," she commanded. "Screenshot it. Email it to a private account he can't access. Then stop talking. Do not confront him. Do not call Camille. From this second on, you are gathering discovery." As I sat there, the engine of my car idling, I began to think like a lawyer for the first time in 14 years. My mind, once clouded by the domestic fog of meal prep and school schedules, began to categorize our life into cold, hard data assets, corporate structure, what I knew, and more importantly, what I could prove. I leaned back in the leather seat, staring at the supermarket entrance, but seeing the floor plan of Mercer and Sterling Law. I recalled the legal architecture of our marriage with startling clarity. I hadn't just been a supportive spouse, I had helped build that firm from nothing. I was the one who drafted the initial partnership agreements, when we were still working out of a one-room office downtown. I knew its structure, its tax filings, and its vulnerabilities better than anyone, including Grant. He had grown arrogant, assuming I had forgotten the language of the law. He thought I was just a resident of 142 Shellmore Boulevard. He was wrong. Before I even pulled out of the parking lot, I used my phone to look up a number I hadn't dialed in a decade. I called Theodora Nash's office. Teddy was a legend in the South Carolina bar, a woman who moved through the courtrooms of Broad Street like a storm front. An hour later, I was walking through the heavy oak doors of her office on Broad Street. The air inside smelled of old paper beeswax and authority. Teddy sat behind a mahogany desk that looked like it could withstand a siege. Her framed diplomas from Yale and Duke lined the walls, a silent testament to a career built on precision. She didn't offer me tea or sympathy. She adjusted her glasses, opened a fresh yellow legal pad, and asked her first question. "When did you first notice the financial irregularities?" Meeting Teddy was like stepping into a different reality. She explained the nuances of South Carolina divorce law with a clinical detachment that I found incredibly grounding. "We are not a community property state, Sloan," she said, her pen hovering over the paper. "We deal in equitable distribution, but more importantly, South Carolina is one of the few states where adultery still matters. It's a bar to alimony, and it heavily influences the division of marital property." I watched her write as she continued, "And financial deception during a marriage matters even more. If he has been using marital funds to subsidize a Second Life dinners at Husk Gifts, perhaps even property, we can claw that back. We don't just want a divorce. We want a reckoning." I told Teddy what I knew. I told her about the Monday nights, the Sterling merger excuses, and the photo in the cloud. She listened with a predatory stillness. When I finished, she told me exactly what we needed. "A photo is a start," she said. "But in this state, we need a pattern. We need to show that this wasn't a lapse in judgment, but a systematic betrayal of the marital contract. Then she leaned forward, her voice dropping an octave. South Carolina is a one-party consent state for recording. Do you understand what that means, Sloan? I nodded, the old legal gears in my head clicking into place. It means I can legally record any conversation I am a part of without informing Grant or Camille. As long as I am a participant in the dialogue, the recording is admissible. Correct. Teddy said, a faint, sharp smile touching her lips. From now on, your phone is no longer a communication device. It is a recording instrument. Every dinner conversation, every late-night excuse, every "I love you" he says before he walks out that door on a Monday, I want it all. The weight in my chest hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer a hollow ache. It was a solid, cold resolve. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a plaintiff. I was a litigator preparing for the biggest case of my life, and the defendant had no idea the trial had already begun. Teddy reached into her desk drawer and slid a heavy cream-colored business card across the polished mahogany toward me. The name on the card was Garrett, followed by a local number. There's someone I work with, Teddy said, her eyes locking onto mine. Former Charleston PD, 22 years. He's a specialist in high-asset domestic surveillance. If Monday nights mean what we think they mean, he will document it in a way that holds up in any courtroom in this state. He doesn't just take pictures. He builds dossiers. I picked up the card. The edges were crisp, the ink raised. It felt like a weapon. When can he start? I asked. He's already waiting for my call. Teddy replied. Go home, Sloan. Be the wife. Be the mother. Be the woman he thinks he knows. Let him think he's winning. That's when men like Grant Mercer become the most careless. Mac Boone met me at a coffee shop on Morrison Drive, a rugged, industrial stretch of Charleston, where the air smells of roasted coffee and salt marsh, far from the polished marble of Broad Street or the prying eyes of Grant's colleagues. Mac was 57, a former Charleston PD veteran with a face that looked like it had been carved from North Carolina granite. He was unhurried, unimpressed by the world, and possessed a stillness that I found immensely reassuring. He didn't look like a private investigator from a movie. He looked like a man who spent his weekends fixing old boat engines and his weekdays noticing things everyone else missed. Teddy says you're sharp, Sloan. Max set his voice a low, gravelly rumble as he stirred a black coffee. Sharp is good. Sharp stays alive in this business. Now, tell me exactly what you want me to see. I gave Mac the assignment with the clinical precision of a lead prosecutor. I didn't want feelings. I wanted data. I needed him to document Grant's Monday nights, every mile driven, every minute accounted for, every location verified and time-stamped. I needed the shadow of the man I thought I knew. Mac nodded, once his expression never shifting. I'll be his shadow, Mrs. Mercer. You just be the wife. Over the following 3 Monday nights, my world split into 2 parallel realities. In the first, I performed the role of the devoted Mount Pleasant mother at 142 Shellmore Boulevard. I made dinner for Grady Tacos 1 week, pasta the next, and sat with him at the kitchen island while he struggled through his honors chemistry homework. We watched television together, the blue light of the screen reflecting off the flawless surfaces of our living room while I laughed at the right moments and asked the right questions about his school day. I was a master of the mundane, a woman whose biggest concern seemed to be the upcoming soccer schedule. But in the second reality, Mac was working elsewhere. He was the silent observer in the dark, the lens through which the truth was finally being captured. While I was tucking Grady into bed or folding laundry, Mac was tracking the silver Porsche as it navigated the winding roads of the Low Country. Mac's first report arrived via an encrypted file on a Tuesday morning. The data was cold and undeniable. Grant didn't go to the office on Monday nights. He didn't stay downtown for strategy sessions. Instead, he drove 45 minutes south to Kiowa Island, an exclusive gated community where the houses cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. Same address, same arrival time window between 7:30 and 7:45 p.m., same departure window at exactly 10:15 p.m. He was a man of habit even in his betrayals, It was the second report, however, that delivered the thing I did not expect, a detail that made the air in my lungs feel like liquid nitrogen. Mac requested another meeting, his tone on the phone more serious than before. When we met back on Morrison Drive, he didn't even order coffee. "There's something you need to know, Sloan," Mac said, leaning in. "I'm not the only one out there in the dark. There's another PI on you. Someone hired a tail. And he's been following your SUV for at least 2 weeks. He's professional, stays 3 cars back, but he's there. Every grocery run, every school drop-off, every trip to the gym." The specific cold of understanding washed over me, a chilling realization that had nothing to do with the winter draft. Grant was not just hiding his own tracks, he was preparing for a war I hadn't realized we were fighting. He was gathering his own discovery, looking for a weakness, a lapse in my character, or a mistake he could use to strip me of everything when the time came to end us. He wasn't just cheating, he was litigating. For all his precision, he had started to overlook small things, the kind that only matter when someone is finally paying attention. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the old courtroom instinct flare up. He wanted a fight. He wanted to catch me in a compromised position. He was measuring the depth of the water before he pushed me in. "What do you want me to do?" Mac asked, watching me closely. "I can burn him for you, make him realize he's been spotted." I looked out the window at the gray Charleston sky and made a decision that would have made Teddy Nash proud. "No," I said, my voice steady and sharp. "I will not change a single thing about my behavior. I will go to the grocery store. I will go to the gym. I will be the most boring, predictable woman in South Carolina. I will give the tale nothing but a gallery of domestic perfection." The performance of an ordinary life was no longer a burden. It became the most precise legal strategy I have ever executed. Every smile I gave Grant when he returned home, every "How was your meeting?" I uttered was now a calculated move in a high-stakes chess match. I was the bait and the hunter all at once. I would let Grant's hired shadow report back that I was exactly who he thought I was, a clueless, contented housewife. Mac reached into his jacket pocket and slid a single high-resolution photo across the table. It was the centerpiece of his investigation so far. The photo showed Grant's silver Porsche parked in the paved driveway of a sprawling modern house on Kiowa Island. The timestamp in the corner read, "Monday night, 8:47 p.m. The house was beautiful, a glass and steel structure overlooking the dunes. But it was the background that caught my eye. Through a large lit window on the second floor, a figure moved, a silhouette that was unmistakably female, lithe and graceful. I stared at the photo until the image burned into my mind. This was the location of my replacement. This was where the 18th year of my marriage was being dismantled every Monday night while I helped my son with his homework. I didn't say a word. I reached into my purse and pulled out a grocery receipt from the Harris Teeter run I had made earlier that morning. I flipped it over. Using a cheap ballpoint pen that was almost out of ink, I pressed down hard the tip, scratching against the paper as I wrote down the address Mac had provided. I wrote it in small, precise numbers, a secret coordinate in a battle that was only just beginning. I stand at the counter, the receipt trembling slightly in my fingers. In the background, I can hear the hum of the coffee shop, the mundane sounds of a Tuesday morning in Charleston. But all I see is that lit window on Kiowa Island. The ink on the grocery receipt was barely dry when the next crack in my reality appeared. It was a Wednesday just after the sunrise had begun to bleed, a pale, cold gold over the marshes of Mount Pleasant. My phone vibrated against the nightstand at 6:53 a.m., a precise, intrusive sound in the quiet of the master bedroom. It was Teddy. Her voice was clipped, devoid of the usual professional pleasantries. She said, "Come to my office before 9. Don't tell Grant you're leaving." I watched Grant sleep for a moment after I hung up. He looked peaceful, his breathing steady, the expensive silk sheets rising and falling with the chest of a man who believed he was entirely in control of his world. I dressed in silence, choosing a sharp, charcoal gray suit that felt like armor. I didn't leave a note. I didn't wake the children. I simply walked out of 142 Shellmore Boulevard and drove toward the city, my heart a dull, rhythmic thud against my ribs. I arrived at Broad Street before the tourists, before the carriage tours, and before the city had fully exhaled its morning mist. The street was quiet, the historic brick buildings standing like stoic sentinels of Charleston's secrets. Teddy was already there. Her office door unlocked the scent of fresh, bitter espresso, cutting through the smell of old law books. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I was sleeping. She simply pointed to the leather chair across from her mahogany desk and placed a single document in front of me. "Take a look at this, Sloane," she said, her eyes fixed on mine with a predatory intensity. It took some digging through the firm's secondary filings, but we found it. It was our primary life insurance policy, a document I had helped set up years ago, when Mercer and Sterling was just beginning to find its footing. It was a standard high-value policy, $1.5 million. I remember the day we signed it in the old office downtown. I remember Grant reaching across the desk, squeezing my hand and saying, "This is for you and the kids, Sloane. If anything ever happens to me, I want to know you're taken care of. I want to know you never have to worry about the mortgage or the tuition." I looked down at the paper, now my fingers tracing the familiar headers. My eyes skipped past the legal jargon and the premium schedules until they landed on the beneficiary line. The space where my name had been printed for over a decade was gone. In its place was a different name, a different life, a different future. The amendment had been filed, quietly processed as a routine policy update I hadn't thought to question at the time. The name was not mine. Teddy did not tell me whose name it was yet. She didn't have to. She simply leaned back in her chair, watching me read, allowing the silence of the room to amplify the weight of the betrayal. I felt the temperature in the office drop 10 degrees. The air became thin, metallic, and hard to swallow. I gripped the edges of the paper, my knuckles turning the color of bone as I stared at the ink. This wasn't just a physical betrayal. This was a calculated attempt to erase my existence and the safety of our children from his legacy. I sat with the document for a long time, the paper crinkling slightly under my touch. I did not cry. The time for tears had passed somewhere between the grocery store parking lot and the coffee shop on Morrison Drive. Instead, I felt a strange, terrifying clarity. Every "I love you," every shared holiday, and every promise of protection was a lie he had been actively dismantling while I slept beside him. How long ago? I asked, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else, someone colder, someone sharper. When was the change made? Teddy adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. 8 months, she replied. 8 months. I let the number settle in my mind. 8 months ago, I was planning Grady's 15th birthday party, obsessing over the details of the guest list and the catering. 8 months ago, Camille had sat in my kitchen, helping me choose the flavor of the cake and laughing about the quirks of teenage boys, while I was trusting her with my family's celebrations. Grant was handing her the financial security he had once promised to me. "This is one document, Sloane," Teddy said, her voice cutting through my thoughts. "But it's the tip of a very large, very dark iceberg. There are more, many more. I need you to be ready for what comes next, because it's going to get much worse before we find the bottom." She reached into a thick manila folder and slid a second document across the polished desk. This wasn't a standard insurance form. It was a corporate structure diagram, a sprawling, jagged map of interconnected entities. There were LLCs registered in Delaware, holding companies in Nevada, and various shell corporations with names that meant nothing. Blue Heron Holdings, Marsh Creek Ventures, Sterling Shield Partners. I looked at the arrows pointing in directions that should not exist in a straightforward, respectable law firm. The money was moving in circles, looping through states with favorable privacy laws, siphoning off the profits of Mercer and Sterling into pockets I hadn't known existed. It was a masterpiece of financial engineering designed to hide assets and obscure the true value of the firm. This isn't a law firm anymore. I whispered my legal training, identifying the patterns of a massive asset-stripping operation. This is an exit strategy. Exactly, Teddy said, nodding slowly. This is what he has been building for the past 3 years. But the architecture itself had begun years earlier. This was only the execution phase. I looked at the diagram, the arrows looking like veins of a parasite. 3 years. He had been planning this for 3 years. Every vacation we took, every renovation we made to the house, every smile we shared in front of our friends was a performance intended to keep me distracted while he moved the foundation of our life out from under us. He thinks he's smarter than you, Sloane. Teddy continued, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. He thinks you've been out of the game too long to see the architecture of what he's doing. He thinks he's the only lawyer in the family. I looked up from the diagram, the cold resolve in my chest, hardening into something permanent. I thought about the car tailing me the woman on Kiowa Island and the name on that beneficiary line. Grant Mercer had spent years building a maze to trap me in. He had forgotten that I was the one who taught him how to read a map. Teddy slides a second document across the desk, a corporate structure diagram. Multiple entities, multiple states, arrows pointing in directions that should not exist in a straightforward law firm. She says, this is what he has been building for the past 3 years. I looked at the corporate structure diagram for a long time before I recognized it. Then I recognized it completely. It wasn't just a map of shell entities and transferred assets. It was a distorted reflection of my own mind. My name is Sloane Mercer, and before I was a ghost in my own home, I was the architect of Mercer and Sterling Law. As I stared at the Delaware LLC, with its sterile mail forwarding address in Wilmington, a wave of sickening familiarity washed over me. I knew exactly how this was built, because I was the one who provided the blueprint. In the beginning, before the house on Shellmore Boulevard and the country club memberships, Grant and I worked side by side in a cramped office that smelled of cheap coffee and ambition. I was the one who drafted the original operating agreements. I was the one who researched the most robust indemnity clauses and designed the tiered partnership structures. I know this architecture because I am part of its DNA. Seeing it used now twisted into a labyrinth of hidden accounts and siphoned profits felt like watching someone use a scalpel I had sharpened to cut out my own heart. You see it, don't you? Teddy asked, her voice cutting through the ringing in my ears. She leaned forward, her shadow stretching across the mahogany desk. He didn't reinvent the wheel, Sloane. He took the foundation you built 18 years ago and added basement levels you were never supposed to find. The irony settled into the room like a thick, suffocating dust. My own legal brilliance, my attention to detail, my dedication to protecting our future Grant had harvested all of it and turned it into a weapon. He had used the very protections I designed to shield our family to instead shield his betrayal. Every Delaware filing, every nested entity like Marsh Creek Ventures was a perversion of the work I had done to ensure our children would never want for anything. Teddy cleared her throat, her expression hardening. I need to confirm the name on the life insurance policy, Sloane. We received the official verification from the carrier 10 minutes before you walked in. She paused, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air. The primary beneficiary is Camille Hargrove. The name landed differently than the photo at Husk had. The photo was a visceral, emotional blow, a sting of personal rejection. But seeing her name on a legal document, positioned to inherit the financial legacy of my marriage, was something else entirely. This wasn't a lapse in judgment or a heated affair. This was deliberate. This was a cold, calculated replacement. Camille wasn't just the woman in the shadows. She was the woman Grant had chosen to take my place in the eyes of the law. The asset transfers didn't happen overnight. Teddy continued, her pen tapping a rhythmic hollow beat against the desk. They began 3 years ago. It has been systematic, careful, and incredibly patient. He's been moving money in increments small enough to avoid internal audits, but large enough to hollow out the firm's actual valuation. He planned this the way a good lawyer plans everything, which means he also made mistakes the way lawyers do. He left a paper trail he thought no one would know to look for. There were LLCs registered in Delaware holding companies in Nevada and various shell corporations with names that meant nothing. Blue Heron Holdings, Marsh Creek Ventures, Sterling Shield Partners. Sterling Voss, the firm's remaining named partner. The man whose signature still appeared on every external filing and client-facing document was either complicit in the architecture or had been kept deliberately blind to it. Teddy circled his name on the diagram with her pen and said nothing. She didn't need to. I looked at the diagram again, focusing on the arrows. They pointed toward accounts in Nevada and shell companies that held title to properties I had never visited. 3 years of late-night strategy sessions and Monday night snags. 3 years of Camille sitting at my dinner table admiring my home while she waited for the keys to be handed to her. Grant had made the oldest mistake a litigator can make. He had fallen in love with his own argument. He had constructed the narrative of my irrelevance, so carefully repeated it so consistently that he had begun to believe it himself. A man who believes his own closing statement stops checking the evidence. He had stopped checking a long time ago. He thinks he's invisible because he's using your own methods against you. Teddy said, her eyes locking onto mine with a sharp predatory glint. He thinks you won't look at the foundation because you're the one who laid the bricks. But that's his fatal flaw, Sloane. You know where the weak spots are. You know where the mortar is thin. Just as the weight of the discovery began to settle into a cold, hard resolve, my phone vibrated on the desk. It was Mac. He had spent the last 48 hours in the old storage unit the firm kept in a climate-controlled warehouse near the neck of the peninsula. Per a written authorization, Lorraine Mercer had signed in her capacity as founding shareholder a right she had held. For 30 years and never once exercised, Mac had been granted access to the firm's off-site storage facility. It was the first time Lorraine's name had appeared on an official firm document since she handed Grant the keys to her life's work. Grant didn't know. He had long since stopped thinking of his mother as someone capable of moving against him. I put the phone on speaker. Mac's voice was low, filtered through the static of a bad connection and the muffled echoes of a hollow room. Sloane Teddy. I've gone through the first 3 crates. Most of it is old litigation files and billing statements from the early years. Did you find the ledger for the initial Delaware filings? Teddy asked. Better? Mac replied. There was a sound of something heavy being moved, a scraping of metal on concrete. I was clearing out the back corner behind the stacks of old tax returns. There's a laptop in here. An old one looks like a model from 5 or 6 years ago. It was tucked inside an unmarked briefcase. My heart skipped a beat. I remembered that laptop. It was the one Grant claimed had been destroyed in a coffee spill years ago, the one that supposedly held the early drafts of our partnership expansion plans. I managed to get it powered up. Mac continued, his breath heavy in the receiver. There's a folder on the desktop. It's encrypted, but the file names are visible. They aren't client names, Sloane. They're dates. Monday dates stretching back years. I haven't opened it yet. I think you should be here when I do. I looked at Teddy. The room felt suddenly very small, the air charged with the electricity of a coming storm. The corporate diagrams on the desk seemed to fade into the background. The real truth wasn't in the shell companies or the insurance policies. It was in that folder. It was the digital diary of a betrayal that had been running longer than I ever dared to imagine. Don't touch anything, Mac. I said, my voice steady, the lawyer in me taking full command. I'm on my way. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit. The architecture of betrayal was sprawling, complex, and built with my own hands. But every building has a door, and Mac had just found the key. I picked up my purse, the business card for the private investigator tucked safely inside. I wasn't just going to a storage unit. I was going to the crime scene of my own life. Mac says, there's a laptop in here, old one. There's a folder on it. I haven't opened it. I think you should be here when I do. The 3 of us, Mac, Teddy, and I, sat around the conference table at Teddy's office on Broad Street. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the hum of the old laptop sitting between us like a ticking bomb. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to cast long, skeletal shadows over the historic district, but inside the light was cold and clinical. Mac had brought the device directly from the storage unit, its silver casing scarred with scratches, a relic of a time I thought I remembered perfectly. My name is Sloane Mercer, and I was about to learn that the last 8 years of my life had been a scripted lie. Mac tapped a key, and the screen flickered to life, the blue light reflecting in Teddy's sharp, expectant eyes. The desktop was remarkably clean save for a single icon tucked in the lower corner. It was a folder named Case Files 2016. It was the most ordinary name he could have chosen, the kind of label a busy lawyer uses for a closed file he never intends to open again. But Grant didn't keep old files on a hidden laptop. He kept secrets. Grant had used a basic, commercially available encryption tool from 2016, the kind of software that had been rendered obsolete by 3 subsequent updates and was now considered a relic by anyone in the field. Teddy patched in her IT consultant remotely. It took him 19 minutes. When the file finally opened, the chime was soft, almost gentle, entirely wrong for what it contained. The header was stark, March 2016. I began to read it aloud, my voice steady at first, then dropping into a low rhythmic monotone so Teddy could take notes on her yellow legal pad. The document was a masterpiece of cold-blooded strategy. It wasn't a diary or a confession. It was a blueprint for a slow-motion execution of a marriage. The transition plan outlined a meticulous timeline for asset transfers that spanned nearly a decade. It listed entities to be created names I now recognized from the diagrams Teddy had shown me earlier, and provided a rigorous schedule for reducing Grant's visible marital income. He had calculated exactly how much to siphon off each quarter to avoid triggering any red flags with our joint accountants. There was a target date for initiating divorce proceedings, a date that was still months away in our current timeline, 8 years. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. He hadn't just decided to leave me recently. He hadn't just fallen in love with someone else. He had been planning his exit since Piper was 13 and Grady was only 7. He had sat across from me at every Thanksgiving dinner every Christmas morning, and every anniversary celebration since then, all while checking off items on a list, designed to leave me with nothing but the dust in the hallway. But as I scrolled further down, the cruelest detail of all emerged from the digital fog. I searched the entire document, my eyes scanning every line of the transition plan for a name I expected to see in every paragraph. I looked for Camille. Camille Hargrove's name does not appear anywhere in this document, not once. She wasn't mentioned as a partner. She wasn't described as a beloved. The woman I had called my person, the woman who had held my hand through the birth of my son, was not the destination of Grant's long journey. She was merely a mechanism. Whether she knew the full extent of his plan or chose not to was something I still didn't understand. The plan detailed how to utilize external real estate connections to legitimize certain offshore transfers. Her family's vast real estate empire in Charleston was the grease on the wheels of his machine. Her name on certain accounts was listed only as a pass-through entity. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat. The difference between Camille and me, I realized, was not the scale of the deception. It was the direction we had been walking when it found us. I had been standing still inside a life I thought was mine while the ground was pulled out from under me. Camille had been walking toward him willingly, eagerly, with her eyes full of a future she had decided to believe in. Grant had lied to both of us, but she had handed him the door. The final stage of the plan involved a set of account numbers Cayman Islands that belonged to no entity either Teddy or I had seen before. These weren't shell companies or Delaware LLCs. These were the endpoints. This was where the substance of Mercer and Sterling was being funneled, a silent reservoir of wealth that existed outside the reach of any South Carolina court. I put the laptop down. The metal felt ice cold against my palms. I needed air. I needed to feel the ground beneath my feet to remind myself that I was still standing. I stood up without a word and walked out of Teddy's office. I stepped onto the sidewalk of Broad Street, the February air hitting my face with a sharp, clarifying sting. I stood there among the tourists and the lawyers in their seersucker suits, and I let myself understand fully what kind of man I had been married to for 18 years. He wasn't just a cheater. He wasn't just a liar. He was a predator who had been hunting his own family from the inside out for nearly a decade. The man I had loved was a ghost, a character he had played so I wouldn't notice the knife he was sharpening behind his back. The grief was gone now, replaced by a crystalline predatory focus. If Grant wanted a transition, I would give him one. But it wouldn't be the one he had spent 8 years perfecting. I turned around and walked back into the office. The bell above the door chimed a sharp, clear sound. I sat down in the leather chair, my back straight, my eyes locked on Teddy. The lawyer, who had been dormant for 14 years, didn't just wake up. She took the lead chair. "What else is there?" I asked. My voice was a blade cold and sharp. Teddy didn't answer immediately. She looked at Mac, then back at me. Her expression was no longer just professional, it was somber. She reached into the thick manila folder that had been sitting at the edge of the table untouched until now. The laptop had one more encrypted partition, Sloan, Teddy said softly. Mac managed to crack it while you were outside. She opened a third folder. It was thinner than the others, but the paper inside looked newer, the ink fresher. She placed it on the table in front of me, sliding it across the polished mahogany with a slow, deliberate motion. The transition plan was about the money and the firm. Teddy said, her eyes never leaving mine. But this one is about you directly. I looked down at the folder. My name was handwritten on the tab in Grant's perfect rhythmic script. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the edge of the paper, knowing that whatever was inside would be the final blow to the woman I used to be. The third folder contained a psychological evaluation. The subject of the evaluation was me. For a moment, the office on Broad Street seemed to tilt on its axis, the rows of leather-bound books blurring into a smear of brown and gold. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the heavy, ivory-colored paper. This wasn't a corporate diagram or a list of offshore accounts. This was an assassination of my character, typed in a clean 12-point font and bound in a professional blue cover. The document was authored by a Dr. Wendell Pruitt, a licensed psychologist with an office in West Ashley. It was dated exactly 6 weeks ago, a time when I was still making Grant's favorite pot roast and laughing at his jokes over Sunday brunch. As I flipped through the pages, I felt a rising sense of vertigo. The evaluation described a woman I didn't know, a ghost inhabiting my skin. According to Dr. Pruitt, the subject, Sloan Mercer, was emotionally unstable, prone to severe anxiety episodes, and suffered from cognitive inconsistencies that made her unable to make sound, long-term decisions. The language was clinical, cold, and devastatingly precise. It detailed observed instances of neglect and documented reports of my inability to provide a stable emotional environment. The report appeared to be built on third-party statements and selective observations, structured to look legitimate without requiring my direct participation. The final recommendation, written in bold at the bottom of the 16th page, felt like a physical blow. The subject is not a suitable primary caregiver for a minor child. This isn't me, I whispered the words, catching in my throat. I looked up at Teddy, my eyes searching hers for some sign that this was a mistake, a clerical error from another case. I've never even met a Dr. Wendell Pruitt. I've never stepped foot in his office. I've never sat for an evaluation. I know you haven't, Sloan, Teddy said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. She took the folder from my hands and laid it flat on the mahogany desk. This document was prepared specifically for the family court. It won't be enough to take custody outright, Teddy continued. But that's not the point. It's meant to plant doubt. Early temporary custody decisions are made fast, and if he frames you first, he controls the narrative before a full evaluation is even ordered. This wasn't evidence, this was positioning. Teddy didn't look away. Grant isn't just planning to leave you. He's planning to erase you. He intends to use this to argue that you are unfit to have primary custody of Grady. He wants the house. He wants the assets, and he wants to ensure you have no leverage to fight him. He's building a cage, and this evaluation is the lock. I stared at the name on the cover, Dr. Wendell Pruitt. In the legal world of South Carolina, attempted fraud on the court is among the most seriously punished legal offenses. It is the cardinal sin of the bar. If a lawyer is found to have knowingly submitted fabricated evidence or a perjured expert evaluation, it doesn't just lose them the case, it can lead to severe sanctions, including disbarment and criminal exposure. Grant knew this. He was a master of the rules, which meant he knew exactly how much he was risking. He was betting everything on the assumption that I was too broken, too unstable, to ever find out what he had done. He's desperate. Mac added from the corner of the room, his arms crossed over his chest. Men only play the unfit mother card when they know the financial paper trail is too messy to hide. He needs you silent, Sloan. He needs you in a position where no judge will believe a word you say about his Delaware LLCs or his Cayman accounts. I didn't say another word. I took a copy of the evaluation and tucked it into my leather bag, the weight of it feeling like lead. I drove home to 142 Shellmore Boulevard in a trance. The afternoon traffic on the Ravenel Bridge, a distant muffled hum. I walked through my front door, greeted the dog, and played the part of the devoted mother until the sun dipped below the horizon and the house fell into its evening slumber. That night, after I was certain Grady was fast asleep in his room, I went into the master bathroom and locked the door. I didn't turn on the main light. I sat on the cold, white tile floor in the dim glow of the vanity lamp. I pulled the evaluation out of my bag and read it again from the very first sentence to the very last signature. I read it again this time, not as a wife, but as a lawyer tracking the language, the claims, the gaps. I have not cried once since finding that photo in the cloud back in January. I didn't cry when I saw the insurance papers or the corporate diagrams. I didn't cry when I realized Camille had betrayed me. My anger had been a hard, dry shield that kept the grief at bay. But I cried now. The tears didn't come from a place of mourning for my marriage. I wasn't weeping for the 18 years of lies or the man I thought I loved. I was crying for the specific, surgical nature of what he was trying to do. He wasn't just stealing money, he was trying to take my son. He was willing to brand me as mentally incompetent, to strip me of my dignity and my motherhood just to ensure his transition plan remained undisturbed. He was willing to orphan Grady from the one person who truly knew him, all for the sake of a clean exit. The betrayal of the heart was one thing. The betrayal of the womb was another. I sat there for a long time, my back against the bathtub, my sobs muffled by a hand pressed hard against my mouth. The house was very quiet, the kind of heavy, oppressive silence that only exists in a home built on secrets. The bathroom tile was cold against my legs, a chilling reminder of the clinical world Grant was trying to trap me in. I felt small. I felt hunted. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt a flicker of genuine terror. I looked at the reflection of the marble and glass, the luxury that was supposed to be my reward for a life well lived. It all looked like a tomb now. I realized then that Grant Mercer didn't just want a divorce. He wanted a total victory. He wanted to walk away with his reputation intact, his pockets full, and my children in his shadow, while I was left a hollowed-out shell in a psychiatric ward of his making. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, the salt water stinging my skin. I needed to move. I needed to call Teddy. I needed to find out who Wendell Pruitt really was and how much Grant had paid for his signature. Just as I started to push myself up from the floor, there was a soft, tentative knock on the bathroom door. I froze my breath, catching in my chest. Mom. Grady's voice was thin, filtered through the heavy wood of the door. He sounded younger than 15, his tone laced with a worry he shouldn't have to carry. "Are you okay in there?" I heard. I thought I heard something. I opened the bathroom door. Grady was standing there, in his socks, holding a glass of water like he had already decided I needed it. The hallway was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the security keypad, but I could see the lines of worry etched into his young face lines that shouldn't belong to a 15-year-old boy. I took a breath, smoothing my hair and wiping the last traces of salt water from my cheeks. The lawyer was back in her cage. The mother took the glass. "Just a headache, honey." I whispered, my voice sounding hollow in the quiet of the house. "I didn't mean to wake you." We migrated to the kitchen at midnight, a silent procession through the museum of my life at 142 Shellmore Boulevard. I sat at the marble island while Grady leaned against the counter, neither of us talking much, just occupying the same space. The refrigerator hummed a low, indifferent sound that underscored the vacuum of our home. I watched him take a slow sip of water. His shoulder slumped under his oversized hoodie, and for the first time since January, I seriously began to calculate. What if I just walked away? The thought was seductive, a siren song of surrender. I could sense a settlement offer coming from Camille, some astronomical number wrapped in a non-disclosure agreement, a golden parachute that would allow Grant to disappear with his reputation intact. I could take the money. I could buy a smaller house, a quieter life in a different zip code where no one knew the Mercers, no courtrooms, no depositions, no staring at photos of my husband with my best friend. I could trade the truth for a version of peace that required no more fighting. But then I looked at my son, and the counter-calculation began to run through my mind with a cold, devastating logic. If I accepted any settlement without fighting the Wendell Pruitt document, I was signing my own death warrant as a mother. Grant would keep that evaluation in his pocket like a loaded gun. Even if we settled, that story would exist in the legal records. Grady would grow up in a world where his father's lawyers had whispered to a judge that his mother was unstable, prone to anxiety, and unfit to care for him. He would grow up with that version of me etched into his history, a shadow of a woman who couldn't be trusted with his heart. I looked at Grady and realized the stakes had shifted again. I was not fighting for the tabby stone of this house. I was not fighting for the millions hidden in the Cayman Islands. I was fighting for the version of his mother that Grady would carry for the rest of his life. I was fighting to ensure that when he looked back on his childhood, he saw a woman of strength, not a fabricated casualty of his father's transition plan. "Mom." Grady's voice broke through my thoughts. He was staring at the darkened window, his expression distant. "Can Grandma Lorraine come visit soon? She always makes things feel less weird. She has that way of looking at Dad like she knows exactly what he's thinking before he even says it." I looked at him, and something shifted in the very center of my resolve. Lorraine. I had not thought about Lorraine in weeks. Grant's mother, the founding partner who had put the Mercer in Mercer and Sterling Law. She was a woman of the old guard, a Charleston matriarch who valued loyalty and legacy above all else. She was the one who had handed the reins of the firm to Grant, but she had never fully relinquished her seat on the board. If Grant was siphoning funds from the firm to subsidize his exit, he wasn't just stealing from me. He was stealing from Lorraine's legacy. He was burning the house his mother had built to keep himself warm. "That's a wonderful idea, Grady," I said, my mind already spinning a new thread in the web I was weaving. "I'll give her a call tomorrow. I think she'd love to spend some time with you." Grady nodded, seemingly satisfied, and set his glass on the counter. "Good. Everything feels like it's holding its breath lately. I just want to hear someone tell a joke that isn't rehearsed." He walked over and gave me a quick, awkward hug, the kind 15-year-old boys give when they don't know how to say they're scared. I watched him head back upstairs, the sound of his footsteps fading into the silence of the second floor. I stayed in the kitchen long after he left. I didn't go back to the master bedroom where Grant lay sleeping. I sat in the dark. The Wendell Pruitt evaluation still burning a hole in my bag in the other room. Grant thought he had prepared for every variable. He had accounted for the assets, the timeline, and my presumed fragility. But he hadn't accounted for his mother, and he certainly hadn't accounted for the fact that a mother's love is the only thing more dangerous than a lawyer's ambition. The next morning, the house was bright with a deceptive South Carolina sun. I watched Grant leave for the office, his navy blazer as crisp as ever, his kiss on my cheek as dry as a desert. I waited until the sound of his Porsche had completely vanished before I picked up the phone. I didn't call Lorraine first. I called the one person who could give me the ammunition I needed to bring her into the fold. I dialed Teddy's direct line, my voice calm, devoid of the tears from the night before. The performance of the ordinary life was over. The litigation had officially entered the discovery phase of the heart. Teddy. I said, my eyes fixed on a framed photo of our family on the mantel, a photo that was now nothing more than a piece of evidence. We need to talk about Piper's college account. I was looking through the trust documents Grady mentioned last night, and I think something is wrong with the numbers. There are withdrawals that don't match the tuition schedule. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the sound of Teddy opening a file. How much, Sloan? Enough to make a grandmother very angry, I replied, and enough to prove that Grant isn't just a liar. He's a thief who steals from his own children's future. I hung up and looked out at the marsh. The tide was coming in cold and relentless. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was going to dismantle Grant Mercer's world peace by lying peace. And I was going to start with the one woman he feared more than any judge in the state. Teddy called me back before noon. The vibration of the phone against the marble countertop was a sharp mechanical intrusion into the deceptive quiet of the kitchen. I didn't even have time to say hello before her voice, tight with a cold professional fury, came through the line. She said, "Your instinct was right. Sit down, Sloan. You're going to need a moment for this." I didn't sit. I stood by the window watching a blue jay peck at the feeder in the garden, its movements frantic and hungry. "Give it to me straight, Teddy. No legal cushioning." $180,000, Teddy stated. The number hung in the air, a staggering weight of betrayal. Over the past 14 months, Grant has siphoned exactly $180,000 out of Piper's college savings account. He was disciplined about it, withdrawals in increments of $10,000 to $12,000, always timed just after a quarterly statement would have been generated, small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts from the brokerage, and just beneath the threshold that would require a secondary signature from a co-trustee. The silence that followed was deafening. I closed my eyes, and suddenly a memory from last semester surged to the surface, hitting me with the force of a physical blow. Piper had called me from her dorm at the College of Charleston, her voice sounding small and confused. She had mentioned that her financial aid recalculation had come back looking strange, that there was a discrepancy in the reported assets of her educational trust. I remember exactly where I was standing in the foyer, preoccupied with the guest list for a firm gala, smoothing the wrinkles out of a silk runner. I had told her not to worry. I had told her it was likely just a clerical error, a lag in the system, and that I would look into it as soon as the gala was over. I never looked into it. The guilt that washed over me was a specific, suffocating brand of shame. I had been so consumed by the effort of surviving the ordinary weeks, so focused on maintaining the crumbling facade of my marriage, that I had missed the tectonic plates of my daughter's future shifting beneath her feet. While I was playing the role of the perfect Mercer wife, Grant was treating our daughter's education like a personal slush fund. He wasn't just a liar or a cheater. He was a thief who was willing to gamble with his own child's security to fund his exit strategy. "Sloan, are you still there?" Teddy's voice snapped me back to the present. "I'm here." I whispered, my hand gripping the edge of the sink until the granite bit into my palm. "Where did the money go?" "Mac is already on it," Teddy replied, the sound of papers rustling in the background. "But the preliminary trail is exactly what we expected. The funds were routed through a third-party clearinghouse and then deposited directly into Blue Heron Holdings, one of the shell entities we identified on the corporate diagram. From there, it vanishes into the Nevada structure. Grant isn't just hiding assets for a divorce. He's actively cannibalizing your children's inheritance to build his new life." "Trace it, Teddy," I said, my voice hardening into a cold, lethal resolve. "I want to know every cent. I want to know if he bought a diamond with Piper's tuition, or if he's using it to pay for that glass house on Kiowa." I hung up and walked out to my car. I didn't have a destination. I just couldn't be inside that house anymore. The walls of 142 Shellmore Boulevard felt like they were closing in, the expensive wallpaper a shroud for the theft occurring within. I sat in the driver's seat in the driveway, the engine off the South Carolina heat beginning to seep through the glass. I stayed there for 20 minutes staring at the front door, realizing that every brick of my life was tainted by his greed. Just as I reached for the ignition, my phone chimed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize, a local 843 area code. I would learn later, through Mac, that Grant had called Camille the night before. He had told her that things were becoming complicated and that it was time to speak with me directly. He had framed it as an act of kindness on her part, a chance to give me a graceful exit before things became public. She had believed him. She always believed him. I think we should meet. There are things about your situation you don't fully understand yet. See. I stared at the initial. The single elegant letter felt less like a signature and more like a brand. I knew exactly who it was. The woman who had driven 4 hours in the rain to sit with me the night my father's casket was lowered into the ground at Magnolia Cemetery. The woman who had held my umbrella when my hands stopped working and said nothing because there was nothing to say. My stomach lurched, a wave of pure, unfiltered nausea rolling through me. She wanted to meet. She wanted to explain the situation, as if 18 years of friendship and a decade of betrayal could be summarized over coffee. I didn't reply. My legal training took over before my heart could scream. I took a screenshot of the message and forwarded it to Teddy immediately. My thumbs were steady, the adrenaline of the hunt overriding the tremor of the hurt. Teddy called back in exactly 4 minutes. Her voice was sharp, tactical. Meet her Sloan. Do not engage emotionally. Do not accuse her of anything. Let her talk. If she's reaching out now, it means the transition plan is hitting a snag, or she's starting to realize she's just a line item in Grant's ledger too. Where should I meet her? I asked, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. Choose a public place you know well, Teddy instructed. Somewhere with enough noise to mask a private conversation, but enough visibility to keep her on her best behavior. And Sloan, remember what I told you about one-party consent in South Carolina? Your phone goes on the table. The recording starts the moment you step out of your car. I want every sigh, every hesitation, and every lie she tells you documented. I looked at the C on my screen one last time before locking the phone. The person I had trusted most in the world was inviting me to a post-mortem of my own life. I'll handle it, I said, my voice as cold as the January morning when this all began. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway. I wasn't just going to a meeting, I was going into a deposition. And this time, I wasn't the one being dismantled. Teddy calls back in 4 minutes. Meet her. Choose a public place you know well. And Sloan, remember what I told you about one-party consent in South Carolina. Camille chose Kaminsky's Dessert Cafe on Market Street, a place we'd sat together 100 times over 18 years. It was our sanctuary for post-shopping lattes and late-night slices of Toll House pie. Coming here now felt like entering a crime scene where the blood had been scrubbed away, but the scent of iron still lingered in the air. The cafe was buzzing with the lunch-hour rush of tourists and locals, the clink of silverware providing the perfect acoustic camouflage for the conversation that was about to dismantle nearly 2 decades of history. I arrived 7 minutes early. I chose a small table in the corner with my back firmly against the exposed brick wall, giving me a clear view of the entrance. I ordered a simple Earl Grey tea, the porcelain cup warm against my palms. My phone sat face down on the scarred wooden table, the screen dark. Before I sat, I had pressed the record button. The digital witness was active, a silent observer sanctioned by the one-party consent laws of South Carolina. Camille arrived exactly 7 minutes late. She moved through the cafe with a lithe, effortless grace, wearing a cream-colored silk dress that spoke of old Charleston wealth. But as she drew closer, I saw what the distance had hidden. Her eyes were bright with the specific, fragile energy of a person who has staked everything on a single outcome and cannot afford for it to go badly. Her hands, when she placed them on the table, were not quite steady. She sat down across from me, fingers interlaced, palms open. She looked like someone who had spent the drive over rehearsing the words and was now terrified they would come out wrong. She looked like a woman in love. She looked like a woman who genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. Sloane, she said, her voice soft and slightly breathless. Thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy. I didn't answer. I took a slow sip of my tea, watching her over the rim of the cup. I was no longer the betrayed friend. I was the lead litigator in a high-stakes deposition. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, forcing her to be the one to break the seal. I'm 3 months pregnant. Camille said the words dropping like lead weights onto the table. She placed one hand over her stomach, and the gesture wasn't strategic, it was instinctive, protective, the movement of a woman whose entire body had already reorganized itself around the fact of this child. Grant and we didn't plan for this to happen while things were still so complicated. But I love him, Sloane. I've loved him for a very long time. And I think if you're being honest with yourself, you've known for years that your marriage has been over. I listened. I did not interrupt. I did not let a single muscle in my face betray the fury vibrating in my marrow. Instead, I leaned forward, my voice low and inquisitive. 3 months. That's significant, Camille. What happens next? What does that timeline look like for you? She exhaled, visibly relieved that I hadn't screamed. She leaned in her voice, dropping to the register we'd always used for our most private conversations. And I felt the ghost of our friendship like a blade between my ribs. We want this to be as painless as possible for everyone, especially for Grady and Piper, she continued. My father is prepared to make you an offer, $2.3 million. Transferred directly from the Hargrove family accounts. This would be in addition to whatever the marital estate provides in a clean, uncontested settlement. Think of it as a fresh start, Sloane. You could go anywhere. You could have a life of your own, away from the gossip and the courtrooms. I asked clarifying questions. I let her talk, watching as she grew more confident, misinterpreting my silence for desperation. She went into detail about the Hargrove trusts, about how Grant wanted me taken care of. The number $2.3 million had come from her father, she said. Grant had told her it was fair. She had believed him about that too. Then she made her mistake. The kind of mistake people make when they are repeating someone else's words without fully understanding what those words mean. Grant is worried about you, Sloane, Camille said, and the thing that stopped my breath was that she seemed to mean it. Her eyes were soft, genuinely troubled. He said things have been hard at home for a long time, that you've been struggling. He mentioned there were some documented concerns about your well-being. He doesn't want any of that to become part of a public proceeding. He doesn't want to hurt you. She said it the way someone repeats a lesson they have memorized without understanding the weight of the words. She had no idea what she was describing. She had no idea what documented concerns meant in a courtroom, or who had done the documenting, or what it would cost me if it were ever entered into the record. Grant had handed her a loaded weapon and told her it was a peace offering. She was holding it out to me with both hands. I looked at her across the table, this woman who had driven 4 hours in the rain to sit beside me at my father's funeral, the woman who had held my umbrella when my hands stopped working. I felt something for which there was no clean word. It wasn't rage, it wasn't grief. It was something far more final than either. It was the absolute, irrevocable death of an 18-year illusion. That's very generous of you, Camille, I said, my voice steady and terrifyingly calm. I really appreciate you being so honest with me about everything, about the baby, the money, and especially about Grant's concerns regarding my health. I meant neither sentence. I was already visualizing the transcript of this conversation being read aloud in a courtroom on Broad Street. I knew you'd understand, Camille said, letting out a breath of relief, her hand finally moving away from her stomach. You were always the sensible one. I stood up, smoothing the front of my suit. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't touch her hand. I picked up my phone and walked out of Kaminsky's, the bell above the door chiming like a funeral bell for our friendship. The March air hit me with a sharp, salt-tinged breeze as I stepped onto Market Street. I felt lighter, the weight of the unknown finally replaced by the heavy, solid certainty of evidence. I pulled out my phone and tapped a command. The recording was already uploading to Teddy's secure server, a digital confession that would haunt Camille Hargrove for the rest of her life. I was halfway to the parking garage when my phone began to vibrate in my hand. I stopped on the sidewalk, the tourists flowing around me like a river. The screen didn't show Teddy's name or Max, or even Grant's. The screen showed Lorraine Mercer. The matriarch was calling. The tide had finally reached the shore. I answered Lorraine's call sitting in my car outside Kaminsky's, the engine idling and the air conditioning humming against the mounting March heat. The recording of Camille's confession was still cooling on my phone, but the voice on the other end of the line was the real temperature gauge of my life. Lorraine didn't waste time with pleasantries. Her voice was like a cello, deep resonant and carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. She said, "Sloan, come to Sullivan's Island. There are things I should have told you a long time ago." But before I could even put the car in gear, she began to tell me what had happened the day before. I sat there gripped by the steering wheel as she described Camille's visit to her beach house. Lorraine narrated it with a quiet, careful attention, the way a woman describes something she is still trying to fully understand herself. Camille had arrived at the Sullivan's Island house looking like the picture of Charleston royalty. She was carrying a Hermes bag, and she was not, Lorraine told me, as composed as she likely intended to be. She sat on Lorraine's antique linen sofa, and she talked about Grant the way young women talk about men they have decided to save with a consuming, breathless certainty that left no room for doubt. She presented the pregnancy not as leverage, but as evidence. Evidence that what she and Grant had was real, was permanent, was the kind of love that deserved to be acknowledged. Lorraine told me that the girl had been shaking slightly, that her hands around the teacup were not quite steady. She wasn't performing confidence, she was borrowing it. She asked Lorraine to welcome her, not with the authority of a woman who believed she had already won, but with the desperation of a woman who needed someone to tell her she hadn't made a terrible mistake. Lorraine listened without expression. It was the same mask, she said, that she had learned to wear at her husband's funeral 30 years ago, a face made of marble that gave nothing away to the vultures circling the estate. When Camille finally fell silent, expecting a blessing or perhaps a tear of joy, Lorraine stood up. She reached down, picked up the Hermes bag Camille had placed so carefully on the side table, and dropped it on the floor. She didn't throw it, she dropped it. It was a gesture of complete terrifying control, the physical manifestation of a social execution. "Get out of my house!" Lorraine had set her voice a low, vibrating hum that made the crystal in the china cabinet shiver. "And don't come back." Lorraine watched from the tall windows of the sunroom as Camille's car retreated down the sandy driveway. She stood there until the dust settled. Then she turned and looked at the framed photograph on the mantel, a portrait of her husband taken the year before his life ended. It was a photo I had seen 1,000 times. The image of a man who looked exactly like a younger version of Grant. I recognized something in that girl's face, Sloan. Lorraine told me over the phone, her voice cracking for the first time. Not cunning, not calculation. I recognized the look of a woman who has been told a story so many times she has stopped questioning whether it's true. I had worn that look myself once, for 9 years. The silence in my car became absolute. I thought I knew the story of Grant's father, a tragic accident on a slippery road, a sudden loss that had forced a 12-year-old boy to grow up too fast. That was the Mercer myth. That was the legend Grant used to justify his drive, his ambition, his need for control. But Lorraine was finally tearing down the curtains. Grant was 12 years old when his father died on the way back from a weekend with someone who was not his mother. He hadn't been coming home from a business trip. He had been coming home from a betrayal, and Lorraine, in her misguided protective love, had never told him the truth. She had scrubbed the police reports. She had silenced the witnesses. She had protected his memory of his father at the cost of her own peace, allowing Grant to grow up believing his father was a flawless hero taken too soon. I protected that memory for 30 years. Lorraine said, her breath hitching in the receiver. I thought I was saving him. I thought I was giving him a foundation of honor to build his life upon. But I was just raising a man who thought he could get away with the same things his father did because he never saw the consequences. I am standing in my kitchen right now, Sloane, understanding exactly what that protection cost you. I see the transition plan in his eyes, and I see his father's ghost in every lie he tells. I felt a surge of empathy so strong it made my chest ache. Lorraine hadn't just been a mother-in-law, she had been a sentry, guarding a secret that had eventually poisoned the very thing she was trying to protect. She saw the pattern now. She saw that Grant wasn't just breaking a marriage. He was repeating a cycle that she had accidentally enabled by her silence. "Come tomorrow, Sloane," Lorraine said, her voice regaining its ironclad resolve. "I have something to give you, something I took from his father's briefcase 30 years ago and kept in a safe deposit box. I thought I would take it to my grave, but I realize now that it belongs to you. It's a USB drive, a digital copy of the files I recovered before the firm's servers were wiped back then." My hand tightened on the phone. This was the missing piece. This wasn't just Grant's transition plan, this was the historical precedent. This was the proof that the rot in Mercer and Sterling went back decades, and that Grant was merely the latest architect of an old familiar betrayal. "I'll be there, Lorraine," I whispered. "Good," she replied. "And Sloane, don't bring the children. This is the kind of truth that burns anything it touches." I hung up the phone and looked out at Market Street. The world was still moving. The tourists were still laughing, and Camille was likely somewhere on the bridge back to Mount Pleasant, replaying our conversation and believing it had gone well. But the tide on Sullivan's Island was turning, and for the first time since January, I realized that I wasn't the only Mercer woman who knew how to finish a fight. "I protected that memory," Lorraine said on the phone, "and I am standing in my kitchen right now understanding what that protection cost you. Come tomorrow. I have something to give you." I drove to Sullivan's Island the next morning alone as Lorraine had asked. The bridge over Breach Inlet felt like a crossing into a different era, leaving the modern gloss of Mount Pleasant for the salt-scrubbed, weathered dignity of the island. Lorraine's house was modest by Sullivan standards, a classic beach cottage with wide porches and a tin roof that had turned a soft, chalky gray over the decades. Inside, the house was a sanctuary of memory. Photographs were everywhere, silver-framed ghosts of a family that had once seemed unbreakable. There was a particular, almost surgical order to the rooms, the hallmark of a woman who had lived alone for a long time and found peace in the precise placement of every book and coaster. Lorraine was waiting for me at her kitchen table. She looked smaller than she had on the phone, the morning light through the window catching the fine lines of a life lived in a defensive crouch. She wore a simple linen shirt, her hair pulled back with a severity that suggested she was preparing for a deposition of her own. She looked like a woman who had been waiting a long time to say something, a woman whose silence had finally become a debt she could no longer afford to carry. "Sit down, Sloane," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. There was no tea this time, no southern hospitality, only the raw, unvarnished truth. She began at the beginning, recounting the 9 years of her husband's separate life with a level of detail that made my skin crawl. She described the other woman, a flight attendant who lived in a small apartment in West Ashley, and the secret accounts that funded a life Lorraine wasn't a part of. She told me what the police report actually said about that night on Highway 17 in 1992. Her husband hadn't been swerving to avoid a deer or a fallen branch. He had been distracted, reaching for a hand that wasn't hers while driving at speeds that suggested a desperate hurry to return to the lie he called home. "I lied to everyone, Sloane." Lorraine said, her voice steady but hollow. "I lied to the partners at the firm. I lied to our friends at the club. But most of all, I lied to Grant. I told him his father died a hero, a man who worked himself to exhaustion for his family. I thought if Grant knew his father had chosen someone else, that he had been living a double life for nearly a decade, it would break something in him that I couldn't fix." We sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the distant roar of the Atlantic surf. The sentence neither of us said aloud hung in the air like smoke. It broke something anyway. By protecting the memory of a ghost, she had accidentally provided a blueprint for the living. Grant hadn't grown up with a father's honor. He had grown up in the shadow of a secret, absorbing the unspoken lesson that a man's true life is the one he keeps in the dark. It just broke him differently, turning his grief into a cold, calculated ambition that mirrored his father's darkest habits. When that girl sat in my living room yesterday, Lorraine continued, her eyes fixing on mine with a fierce, burning clarity. I understood what I had actually taught my son. I thought I was teaching him resilience, but I was actually teaching him that this is just what men do. I taught him that the women stay quiet, that we accept the crumbs and the cover stories, that there are no consequences as long as the outward appearance remains uncracked. I saw my husband's arrogance in Camille's smile, and I realized that my silence had become the foundation for your misery. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. She walked to the kitchen drawer near the sink, the one where most people keep spare keys or grocery coupons. She reached into the back and pulled out a small metallic object. She returned to the table and placed a USB drive between us. It looked small and insignificant against the grain of the old wood, but I knew it held the power of an earthquake. I am a founding shareholder of Mercer and Sterling Law Sloan, she said, her voice regaining its ironclad authority. I helped my husband build that firm when Grant was still in diapers. I have never exercised my right to sit in on board meetings or vote on policy in 15 years. I wanted to stay out of Grant's way. I wanted him to feel like he earned his seat at the head of that table. She paused, a sharp, bitter smile touching her lips. But I have received and kept every financial document the firm was required to distribute to its shareholders for 15 years. Every audit, every tax filing, every capital call. I've kept them all in a safe deposit box, along with the digital copies the firm's compliance officer is required to send to the founders. I didn't know what I was keeping it for until now. I reached out and touched the cool metal of the drive. 15 years of data. If Grant was moving money through Delaware LLCs or hiding assets in the Cayman Islands, this drive would provide the before and after that Teddy and Mac needed. It was the historical record of a decade and a half of financial evolution, or rather financial cannibalism. Grant thought he was playing a game of chess with me, but he hadn't realized his own mother had been recording every move for 30 years. Everything you need is on there, Lorraine said. The password is your anniversary date. Grant's father used the same one for his private accounts. I suppose some patterns are truly universal. I felt a surge of adrenaline so potent it made my fingers tingle. Lorraine wasn't just giving me evidence. She was giving me the keys to the kingdom. She was handing me the one thing Grant couldn't explain away as unstable or emotional. This was hard data backed by her authority as a founding partner. "I'm sorry it took me this long to see it, Sloan," she whispered as I stood to leave. "You're seeing it now, Lorraine," I replied, leaning over to press a kiss to her cheek. "And that's all that matters." I drove back to Mount Pleasant with the USB drive tucked deep in my coat pocket, the weight of it a comforting pressure against my ribs. The salt air of the island felt cleaner now, as if the fog of 30 years had finally begun to lift. I didn't wait until I got home. I didn't even wait until I was off the island. I pulled over just before I reached the bridge and called Teddy. "I have everything," I said, my voice vibrating with a cold, triumphant energy. "All of it. 15 years of internal filings and the original partnership documents. I think we're ready, Teddy. It's time to end the transition plan." I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the tired housewife from January. She was a litigator with a winning hand, and the trial was finally about to begin. I drive back to Mount Pleasant with the USB drive in my coat pocket. I call Teddy before I reach the bridge. "I have everything. All of it. I think we're ready." Piper called me on a Thursday afternoon in May, her voice tight with a sharp analytical edge that reminded me terrifyingly of my younger self. The semester was winding down at the College of Charleston, but the news she had stumbled upon wasn't academic. She said, "Mom, I Googled Dad's firm this morning for a research project. There's a legal notice filed in the state records, something about a restructuring of the founding partner's equity. What's happening?" Why didn't anyone tell me? I didn't have time to craft a careful motherly response. Piper didn't wait for permission. She simply appeared at the front door of 142 Shellmore Boulevard that evening. Her car still idling in the driveway, a single overnight bag slung over her shoulder. She didn't hug me. She looked at me with the eyes of a woman who had already sensed the foundation of her world was cracking. I sat her down at the kitchen table, the same marble island that had seen 18 years of family breakfasts and late-night homework sessions. I looked at my daughter, 21, brilliant, and standing on the precipice of her own life, and I made a choice. I would not simplify. I would not shield her with half-truths the way Lorraine had shielded Grant. I told her everything. I laid out the transition plan, the Delaware LLCs, the offshore accounts, and the manufactured psychological evaluation by Wendell Pruitt. Piper listened the way she has always listened, perfectly still. Her chin tilted slightly, her mind processing the data before she allowed herself to speak. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She absorbed the betrayal with a cold, terrifying grace. When I finally finished, the silence in the kitchen was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the evening cicadas outside, the weird financial aid letter last semester. Piper said softly, her eyes fixing on a point somewhere past my shoulder. The one I called you about. The one where the reported assets in my trust didn't match the previous year's filings. $180,000. That's what was missing, wasn't it? I nodded, the guilt of my earlier dismissal stinging like an open wound. Yes, Piper. He siphoned it into a shell entity. He was using your future to fund his exit. She closed her eyes for a moment, and I saw the realization settle into her features. She had noticed the discrepancy months ago. She had filed the confusion away in the back of her mind because she didn't know what to do with it, or perhaps because the truth was too monstrous to contemplate without proof. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave. "About Camille." I told her about the Monday nights. I told her about the house on Kiowa Island and the name on the insurance policy. Piper's expression changed then, a dark and complicated recognition settling across her face. "She came to campus," Piper said, her fingers tracing the edge of the marble, "back in February. I didn't tell you because she said it was a surprise for your upcoming anniversary. She took me to lunch at Hank's Seafood, the fancy room in the back. What did she want?" I asked, my voice careful and even. She asked about my classes, my plans after graduation, whether I wanted to stay in Charleston. But mostly she asked about you, whether we were close, whether you seemed happy, whether I thought you and Dad were okay. Piper paused, her jaw tightening. At the time, I thought she was checking in, being the concerned family friend, but sitting here now, I think she was trying to figure out what kind of person you were. Not because she wanted to use it against you, because she was building a picture of the life she thought she was about to step into. She wanted to know who I was because she thought she was going to be part of my life. She believed it, Mom. Whatever else she is, she believed it completely. The understanding of what that visit truly was, a woman trying to prepare for a future she had been promised, settled between us like a physical weight. Camille wasn't a strategist. She was a person who had been given a map to someone else's life and had started memorizing the streets. I reached across the table and held my daughter's hand. Her skin was cold, but her grip was like iron. For 18 years, I had tried to build a world where my children felt safe, where the name Mercer stood for something unbreakable. That world was gone, replaced by a battlefield where the enemy was sleeping in the master bedroom. Mom! Piper said, her eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, unwavering intensity. Are you going to win? Are we going to take back what he stole? Yes. I said the word, a vow, a prayer, and a declaration of war, all in one. We are going to win, Piper. I have Teddy, I have Mac, and I have the shareholder records from your grandmother. We are going to dismantle every lie he ever told. Then I want to be there, Piper said, her voice regaining the sharp litigator's edge. Whatever comes next, I want to be in the room. I'm not a child anymore, and I'm not a victim. I'm a Mercer, and I know how he thinks. She stood up and opened her laptop, the screen illuminating the dark kitchen with a clinical blue glow. I used to do his filing when I was in high school, remember, for 3 summers. I was the one who organized the digital archives for the older litigation files. I did it for extra gas money, but I was bored, so I started paying attention to the file structures. I remember things about how the office server worked, how we used to ghost certain folders so they wouldn't appear on the main directory. Things you might not know because you haven't been in the office in years. She looked at me, a grim, determined smile touching her lips. Tell me what Teddy needs, Mom. If he's hiding data on that firm's server, I can tell you exactly which backup drive he's using. He thinks he's the only one who knows the system, but he taught me everything I know about organization. I looked at my daughter and felt a surge of pride so potent it nearly overwhelmed the grief. Grant had spent years planning a transition that would leave me powerless and my children sidelined. He had accounted for the money, the law, and the timing. But he had forgotten the most important rule of the courtroom: never underestimate the witness you thought you had already silenced. Piper leaned over the keyboard, her fingers poised to strike. Let's find the rest of the money, Mom. Let's show him what happens when you steal from a woman who raised a daughter like me. Teddy filed the divorce petition on a Tuesday morning in late May, a day that started with the deceptive honey-colored light of a South Carolina spring. The machinery of justice, once set in motion, is a cold and relentless thing. She texted me at 2:47 p.m., the short vibration of my phone feeling like the strike of a gavel. Grant has been served at the office, in front of the junior partners. He's going to call you. Don't answer. Let the silence do the talking. I followed her instructions to the letter. Grant called 11 times between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. each time. I watched his name flash on the screen, the man I had shared a bed with for 18 years, and I felt nothing but a clinical, detached curiosity. I didn't silence the ringer, I let it chime, a rhythmic reminder of his mounting desperation. Each unanswered call was a deposition he couldn't win a cross-examination where his silence was the only evidence I needed. While I sat in the bleachers at Grady's track meet cheering as my son pushed through the final 100 meters of his race, Teddy was providing me with the rest of the wreckage via encrypted updates. The transition plan hadn't just blown up in Grant's face, it had ignited a secondary firestorm he never saw coming. Harlan Hargrove's legal team had filed a parallel civil action against Grant that same week. According to the court records Teddy forwarded, the real estate tycoon had unleashed his own investigators after certain irregularities in the Hargrove family's secondary accounts came to light. They had confirmed what I already knew. Grant had used their vast real estate connections as nothing more than financial pass-throughs. He had used Camille's family name to legitimize his offshore transfers with absolutely no intention of building a future with her. He wasn't building a life for a new family. He was building a fortress for himself. Camille had been moved to London overnight, not to protect her, but to protect the Hargrove name. Harlan's legal team had made the calculation that a visibly pregnant daughter at the center of a fraud trial was a liability no family trust could absorb. She had been advised through counsel that her presence in Charleston during active litigation created exposure for the family's civil action against Grant. She was told it was temporary. She was told a great many things that month that turned out not to be true. The flat in Belgravia was comfortable, I was told. The windows looked out over a park. She had been given everything except the one thing she had actually wanted. The pregnancy, as far as the public record was concerned, remained a private matter. Teddy noted it in our file and said nothing further. Some threads, she told me, resolved themselves. What I understood and did not say aloud was that Camille was now alone in a foreign city, carrying a child whose father was facing federal wire fraud charges, protected by a family that had already begun to treat her as collateral damage. I did not feel triumph when I thought about this. I felt something closer to the specific, exhausted grief of a woman who finally understood that Grant Mercer had never loved anyone enough to tell them the truth. When I pulled into the driveway at 142 Shellmore Boulevard after the track meet, Grant's silver Porsche was already there. It was parked crookedly, a rare sign of disorder from a man who prided himself on flawless lines. I took a breath, looked at Grady in the passenger seat, and told him to go upstairs and start his shower. I walked into the kitchen and there he was. Grant Mercer was standing by the marble island, his blazer discarded on a chair, his silk tie loosened. He looked composed at first, the practiced mask of a senior partner facing a difficult board, but as I approached, I saw the cracks. His eyes were bloodshot and there was a slight, frantic tremor in the hand that held a stack of legal papers. "You didn't give me a chance to explain Sloan," he said, his voice straining to maintain its usual courtroom resonance. This petition, it's a work of fiction. We could have handled this privately. We could have sat down like adults. You had 18 years to be an adult, Grant. I replied, my voice as steady as the tide. And you had 8 years to explain the transition plan you were drafting while I was putting our children to bed. You don't get to request a private audience when you've been litigating against your own wife in the dark for a decade. He flinched the mention of the plan, stripping away the last of his composure. He stepped toward me, his face twisting into something I didn't recognize, a mixture of arrogance and terror. "You think you can take Mercer and Sterling?" He hissed, his voice dropping to a predatory whisper. "I built that firm. I am the firm. And if you think a judge is going to hand over the equity to a woman who hasn't practiced in 14 years, you're more delusional than Dr. Pruitt's report suggested." The mention of the psychological evaluation was his final mistake. He was still trying to use it, still trying to gaslight me in my own kitchen. "Don't do this, Sloan," he said, suddenly shifting gears into a desperate, manipulative plea. "Think about Grady. Think about what a public custody battle will do to him. He's 15. He needs a father who has a reputation left. If you push this, if you go through with the fraud allegations, you're taking his father away from him. Is that what you want for our son? To be the boy whose mother destroyed his family over a few accounts?" He was using Grady as a negotiating position. He was trying to weaponize my son's well-being to protect his own skin, oblivious to the fact that he was the one who had already set the house on fire. "You should have thought about Grady before you stole $180,000 from his sister's future," I said, my voice echoing in the sudden sharp silence of the kitchen. "And you should have thought about him before you paid a stranger to write a lie about the mother who raised him." Grant opened his mouth to respond, to pivot, to find another angle. But for the first time in his professional life, the words failed him. He looked at me, and I think he finally saw the woman I had become, the litigator who'd been waiting in the shadows, finally stepping into the light. "Leave Grant," I said, my voice quiet and final. "The locks are being changed in an hour. Your assistant has the address of the hotel where we've sent your things. From this moment on, you only speak to me through Teddy." He stared at me for a long beat, his face pale, before grabbing his blazer and walking out. The heavy mahogany door closed with a definitive, hollow thud that seemed to shake the very foundation of 142 Shellmore Boulevard. I stood there, the silence of the house returning heavy and thick. I didn't realize Grady was there until I heard the creak of the floorboards above. I looked up to see him standing at the top of the stairs, still in his track gear, his face white as a sheet. He had heard everything: the theft, the lies, the plan. "Mom," he said, his voice small and trembling, sounding like the 7-year-old boy he had been when the transition plan began. Did he really try to take me away from you? Did he really try to tell people you weren't okay? The weight of the truth was a jagged thing, but I refused to shield him from it any longer. He deserved to know the identity of the man he was supposed to look up to. I look up at my 15-year-old son at the top of the stairs and I tell him the truth for the first time. He tried. I say, my voice as hard as diamond. He won't. Everything is about to change at 142 Shellmore Boulevard. If you're still here before the final courtroom showdown, comment "Reckoning" below. Note, this is a fictional, dramatized story. If you don't like it, you can stop now. But if you stay the next part, the real battle is just beginning. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in August at the Charleston County Family Court on Broad Street, 3 months after the petition was filed, which in contested divorce proceedings with documented financial fraud is considered fast. The August heat in the Low Country was not merely a temperature, it was a physical presence, a humid, salt-heavy weight that made the very air feel thick enough to drown in. But inside the courthouse, the world changed. The air was pulled down to a sharp, artificial chill, a clinical coldness that seemed to freeze the nerves before the first word was ever spoken. I describe walking into the courtroom, the smell of the building, a permanent layering of floor wax old parchment, and the sharp metallic tang of recycled air. There is a particular quality to a space where things become permanent, a gravity that anchors your feet to the linoleum. It is a room designed for the finality of things, where a decade of shared life is reduced to a docket number and a stack of marked exhibits. I moved to the petitioner's table, my movements slow and deliberate. I felt the weight of the high ceilings, the way the light fell in dusty vertical shafts from the tall windows, casting long shadows that felt like the bars of a cage we were finally dismantling. My hands, resting on the mahogany surface, were still. For the first time in 14 years, I wasn't here to support a partner. I was here to reclaim a soul. Grant entered 5 minutes later. He didn't walk into the room, he processed into it. He was accompanied by his lead attorney from a prestigious Columbia firm, a man who looked like he had been manufactured from the same expensive polished leather as the portfolio he carried. Grant wore a seersucker suit that spoke of old-world confidence and a tie that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. He looked like a man who believed he was still the architect of the room, still the narrator of a story he could edit at will. He scanned the gallery with a practiced, dismissive gaze, searching for the version of the wife he thought he had successfully buried under a mountain of gaslighting and psychiatric reports. Then he saw me. And then his eyes shifted 2 inches to the left and he saw Lorraine sitting directly beside me. Something in Grant's face changed in a way I have never seen before and will never forget. It was as if the very marrow of his bones had suddenly turned to ash. The practiced courtroom mask he had spent 20 years perfecting didn't just crack. It disintegrated in real time. His skin took on the sallow, grayish hue of a man watching his own execution from the front row. He stared at his mother, the founding partner, the woman whose legacy he had been siphoning away, the woman whose silence had been his greatest shield for 30 years. For a full, agonizing minute, he stood frozen in the aisle, oblivious to his attorney's nudge. He looked at Lorraine's hand the way it rested near mine, the fingers interlaced in a silent, unbreakable pact of Mercer women. In that single frozen look, he realized that the transition plan hadn't just failed. It had been treason against the only person he actually feared. The arrogance that usually radiated from him like heat vanished, replaced by the look of a child caught in a burning room, realizing for the first time that the door was locked from the outside. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged, only the hollow, jagged breath of a man who had finally run out of lies. Teddy stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She began to present the evidence in layers, each one a different register of impact that made the air in the room feel thinner and heavier with every passing second. She started with Mac's photographs. They appeared on the large monitors in high definition: the silver Porsche, the Kiowa Island driveway, the shifting light of Monday nights. The courtroom watched the cold, time-stamped choreography of a betrayal that had become a routine. I didn't look at the screen. I looked at Grant's profile. With every slide, I saw his jaw tighten, his composure eroding under the relentless documentation of his double life. Each photo was a nail in the coffin of the sterling merger alibi he had used to keep me in the dark. Then came the Kaminsky's recording. Hearing Camille's voice in that sacred legal space was jarring a ghost of a friendship that had been a hollow shell for years. Her words about documented concerns regarding my well-being, spoken in the voice of a woman who genuinely believed she was helping, landed with devastating force. Under South Carolina's one-party consent law, every syllable was a blow. I watched Grant's hands begin to shake beneath the table, his fingers twisting a gold pen as Camille's voice confirmed the very fraud he had hoped to use to strip me of my children. She had not known what she was confessing. That somehow made it worse. Teddy moved to the corporate structures, the Delaware LLCs and the Cayman accounts, found on Lorraine's USB. The case file's 2016 document was projected onto the wall, the 8-year timeline laid bare like a map of a long-planned heist. Seeing Camille's name absent from the final destination accounts was the quietest, most brutal part of the morning. It proved that Grant Mercer didn't love anyone. He only loved the exit. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, a sound that seemed to count down the seconds of Grant's career. The air in the room shifted when Teddy called Dr. Wendell Pruitt to the stand. It took her exactly 11 minutes to dismantle the man. Under her surgical questioning, the evaluation of my mental state was revealed for what it was, a paid-for fiction. The judge's voice, when she finally spoke, was a low, vibrating hum of controlled fury. She used the phrase, attempted fraud, upon this court, with a rhythmic finality that seemed to echo in the high corners of the room. Grant's attorney leaned back, his face a mask of professional resignation. He knew. The final silence fell when Sterling Voss was called. He didn't look at Grant. He looked at the judge, and then he looked at me. He chose his own legal survival over a partnership built on sand. He confirmed the ghost folders and the systematic hollow-out of the firm. He was the final witness to the death of Mercer and Sterling. Grant leaned to his attorney and whispered something frantic, his face damp with sweat. His attorney listened for 3 seconds, looked at the mountain of evidence, and slowly shook his head. It was the movement of a man who had already started drafting his closing bill. The judge didn't take a recess. She issued the temporary orders with the speed of a falling blade. All marital and firm assets were frozen. Primary physical and legal custody of Grady was granted to me on a temporary basis, effective immediately, and pending the outcome of the full evidentiary hearing. In the gallery behind me, I heard someone exhale a long, slow breath of release. I didn't turn around to see who it was. Both attorneys understood without saying so that temporary orders issued on this weight of evidence carry a particular kind of permanence. Grant's attorney did not object. He had stopped objecting to things 20 minutes ago. Grant was ordered to surrender his passport to the clerk of court pending the criminal referral to the state's attorney general. In the hallway during the short recess, as the lawyers huddled to coordinate the freeze, Grant approached me. He looked smaller, the seersucker suit suddenly looking like a costume that didn't fit. Sloan, he started, his voice a pathetic, rasping shadow of the authority it once held. He looked as if he expected me to give him an opening, a chance to litigate one last lie. I didn't answer. I didn't even stop walking. I turned my back on the man I had lived with for 18 years and walked back into the courtroom to finish the paperwork of my freedom. The judge's preliminary findings are entered into the record. I sit very still and listen to them read aloud the cold legal confirmation that the transition plan has failed and that the house on Shellmore Boulevard is finally mine in more than just name. Beside me, Lorraine reaches over and places her hand on top of mine. Her grip is firm, weathered, and grounded. Neither of us says anything. We just sit there in the cooling air of the Broad Street courthouse, two women who finally stopped keeping secrets. Grant was formally charged under South Carolina criminal statute and federal wire fraud provisions 6 weeks after the preliminary hearing. His bar license was suspended pending the outcome. Mercer and Sterling law dissolved within the month. I learned most of this through Teddy and later through the public record. The downfall of a man who spent his life crafting an image of perfection is a messy public affair, but I chose to experience it from a distance. I was no longer interested in the spectacle. I was interested in the reconstruction. I did not attend Grant's sentencing. I had already seen enough of him in courtrooms to last a lifetime. I sent Teddy in my place a silent proxy who reported back that he had looked older, his confidence stripped away by the federal orange jumpsuit. The final settlement was a clinical correction of a decade's worth of theft. The house at 142 Shellmore Boulevard was granted to me in full clear of any of Grant's debts. The retirement accounts were adjusted for the years of suppressed income he had tried to hide. I was awarded alimony for 8 years calculated on his documented earning capacity, rather than the false numbers he had presented to the board. Most importantly, Grady's remaining educational expenses were secured in a locked trust, and Piper's college fund was restored in full, plus the interest it would have accrued had it stayed in her name. Piper and Grady saw their father once more before his sentencing. It didn't happen in a courtroom or a visiting booth. I arranged for it to happen at Teddy's office, a neutral territory where they could say what they needed to say without the pressure of a judge's gaze. They told him they forgave him, not for his sake, but for theirs. They told him they did not want to live with him a final rejection of the transition plan that had treated them like collateral. Grady, ever the empathetic soul, reached out and shook his father's hand, a formal goodbye to the hero he used to believe in. Piper did not. She stood by the window, her arms crossed her silence, a sharp, unwavering boundary. Lorraine moved into the guest room on a Sunday in October. The air was turning crisp, the marsh grass turning a deep, golden ochre. She arrived with only 2 bags and a heavy, seasoned cast-iron skillet that she said had belonged to her mother. It was a humble addition to my high-end kitchen, but it carried more weight than all the designer appliances combined. Having her in the house didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a closing of a circle. We were 2 women who had been lied to by the same line of men, now finding a way to exist in the truth. There were things I changed in the house almost immediately. I repainted my office. It was no longer the sterile, professional gray that Grant had chosen to match his aesthetic. I chose a warm, soft cream that caught the morning light, a color that made me feel like I could actually think. I started sleeping on the right side of the bed, the side that used to be his, simply because I could. I called my mother on Tuesdays instead of Sundays, breaking the rigid schedule Grant had enforced for years. But there were things I kept. I kept the house itself, reclaiming the tabby stone and the wraparound porch as my own. I kept the heavy mahogany kitchen table where we had shared 18 years of meals, though the air around it felt lighter now. And I kept a single photograph on the mantel, a shot of Piper and Grady at the beach when they were small, their faces smeared with salt and joy, taken before the case files ever existed. Nora came for dinner on a Friday in November. We sat on the back porch wrapped in blankets looking out at the dark water of the marsh. The silence of the low-country evening was interrupted only by the distant call of a heron. She looked at me, her expression unhurried, and asked the only question that mattered, "You good Sloane." "Getting there," I said, and for the first time in a year the words didn't feel like a rehearsed line. Nora nodded, leaning back in her chair. We sat in the kind of silence that does not have a shape. It wasn't the heavy, hollow silence of a house holding its breath. It was a solid, peaceful quiet, the silence of a life that no longer had anything to hide. One Saturday morning in December, the house smelled of rosemary and warm dough. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched a scene I never could have imagined a year ago. Lorraine was at the island, her sleeves rolled up, teaching Grady how to make biscuits from scratch in that old cast-iron skillet. She was patient, her weathered hands guiding his as they worked the butter into the flour. Piper was on a video call from her dorm, her face bright and visible on the iPad propped against the fruit bowl. She was laughing at something Grady just said about his lack of culinary skills, her voice filling the room with a genuine, unforced warmth. I leaned against the doorframe and thought about the Monday nights. I thought about how quiet this house used to feel after Grant left, how that silence had a shape. A cold, sharp edge that made me want to shrink into the furniture. I remembered the cold tea and the staring out the window at the disappearing taillights of a Porsche. This silence is different. This silence is just quiet. It's the absence of noise, not the presence of a lie. This is not the life I planned. Not one part of it went the way I thought it would when I was 23 years old, and believed that love, if you were careful enough and practiced enough, could be made to hold like a well-drafted contract. I didn't plan for the betrayal, the shell companies, or the psychological evaluations. I didn't plan for the man I loved to be a stranger. But I am standing in my kitchen on a Saturday morning in December, and every single thing in this room, the cast iron skillet on the stove, the laughing on the screen, the white flour on my 15-year-old son's hands, every single thing is mine. It is earned, it is honest, and it is whole. And that I have learned is more than enough. Standing at the kitchen window of 142 Shellmore Boulevard, I finally understand that the greatest family betrayal isn't just the secrets kept, but the parts of ourselves we abandon to keep those secrets quiet. My journey through this family revenge taught me a bitter truth. I was a world-class litigator who stopped cross-examining her own life. Don't be like me. Don't mistake a comfortable silence for peace and never trade your intuition for a gilded cage. I ignored the red flags for 18 years, believing that if I was perfect enough, the cracks wouldn't matter. But a family betrayal of this magnitude, a decade-long transition plan, proved that you cannot save a house built on sand. I believe that everything happens for a reason. Perhaps God allowed the light to break through my blinders so I could save my children before the foundation collapsed entirely. Justice in this family revenge wasn't just about the bank accounts. It was about reclaiming the woman I was meant to be. This family betrayal nearly destroyed me, but it also forced me to find a strength that no contract could ever provide. Life is unpredictable, and sometimes the ultimate family revenge is simply living well surrounded by the truth. Thank you for accompanying me on this long journey until the very end. Please leave a comment to share your thoughts. How would you react if you were in Sloane's shoes in a marriage full of lies? I'm really curious about your perspectives. If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss out on our upcoming journeys. A small note. Although inspired by social issues, some elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this story isn't suitable for you, feel free to explore other content on the channel that may be more aligned with your interests.
Thanks for your time today. I'll see you again in the next story.